question or another point that was raised by expert media people in the Indian media is that the verdict which was given by the court was more emotional, faith-based judgment and not a judgment based on hard facts which was presented in front of them. What do you think about this?
Well, all through this controversy, the secularists, the so-called secularists, have been purposely confusing two questions. One is whether a temple had stood at the site that was demolished by Islamic iconoclasm, and whether Rama was born at the site. I must say that in the Hindu nationalist camp also a bit of confusion has existed about these 2 points. Now, these are two very different things. You see, about the medieval and modern history of the site, it is not very difficult to establish the facts. So, of course, there was a temple, and of course it was demolished. There are some questions of detail that have yet to be settled. For example, how many times was a temple demolished at the site? We know that that area, and probably Ayodhya itself too, was conquered in 1033 by Salar Masud Ghaznavi, the successor, I think nephew of Mahmud Ghaznavi. And he very probably destroyed the important temples he came across. That's what he's been doing elsewhere also. And in fact that would fit very well with the chronology of the temple of which an inscription has been found in 1992, which dates the building of that temple to the decades after that. So it is quite possible that earlier a temple was demolished, and then the temple that we now have, or of which we have found the remains, was built after that. That after the demolition of the temple, the local Hindu ruler said, now let's make a really big temple. So, you know, there are some points that have to be established. I mean, there's a long history of Muslim rule. First of all, this first invasion of that area in 1033. Then you get the whole sweeping conquest of North India in 1192-94 by Muhammad Ghori and his lieutenants. Then you have the whole period of the Delhi Sultanate, which was very oppressive for Hindus, and practically, you know, at any rate, tried not to allow temple building. Then you get a period of turmoil under the Lodis with the invasion of the Mughals. Then initially you get a campaign of iconoclasm by Babar. But then Muslim rule settles, and there is a certain compromise with the Hindus, which becomes official, and which goes pretty far in accommodating Hindus under Babar. Then you have a gradual revival of iconoclasm under Jahangir Shah Jahan. Then you have a full campaign of iconoclasm, destroying thousands of temples under Aurangzeb. So all these different phases, you see, as they apply to that particular site, you know, there's a lot of work to do to establish all the details. So I can't say we know all about that. But that the scenario of Islamic iconoclasm applies, that is quite certain. However, it is an entirely different matter whether Rama was born there. You see, that is a historical question of a totally different nature. It is very difficult to establish whether somebody was born somewhere. I mean, and that is in the nature of historical research. You see, in physics, you can reproduce your findings. You have an experiment, and then you have somebody else somewhere conduct the same experiment to see if the same, you know, physical laws that you hope to discover apply. But in history, you see, did Napoleon exist? Did Alexander the Great exist? Of course, we have many sources referring to them, but maybe they were mistaken. Maybe it was a big conspiracy to fool later generations. Who knows? I mean, the secularists are certainly not beyond that kind of conspiracy explanation. So in the case of Rama too, you see, I think you should accept that it is very hard, if not in principle impossible, to establish the birthplace of Rama and even many other aspects of his existence. For example, about Jesus, I just went through this book. Jesus was Caesar. And it has the somewhat strange thesis that, you see, if at all there was a person called Jesus, at any rate the story told about him in the Gospels is mainly a retelling of the historical story of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, the Roman emperor, who entered Rome triumphantly, coming from Gallia, Gaul, which is now Belgium and France. And similarly, Jesus triumphantly entered Jerusalem, coming from Galilee. And Jesus was killed by, in an official, or at least on orders of an official meeting of Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, with the betrayal by one of his friends, Judas. Likewise, Caesar was murdered in the Senate by his fellow politicians, including his close friend Brutus. And so on. You see, a number of details seem to match. It is as if the story of Jesus is a copy of the story of Caesar. Now, I have no idea if this is true. And in fact, there are numerous books of this kind, giving the true story of Jesus. Why? Well, precisely because we know very little about Jesus. It is most likely that he existed, but of course there are also serious scholars who argue that he didn't exist. And the story we have of him is obviously a composite story. You see, you have Jesus the miracle maker, Jesus the claimant to the status of Messiah, some specifically Jewish notion. Then you have Jesus telling all these nice stories about turning the other cheek and peaceful and so on, which some people say is based on Buddhism. Anyway, there's a lot to say about Jesus, but to establish what is really historical there is very difficult. Yet, you see, the Indian government does not demand of Christians that before they can build churches with crosses and Jesus on them, first they have to prove that Jesus existed, that Jesus was crucified, that Jesus was resurrected. Nobody asks this. You see, we are not very sure about the ultimate truth. So we accept, we ourselves and our fellow human beings, we are all looking for the truth, we are trying out certain things. And we are very imperfect. To a large extent, we believe what our parents have told us and so on. And you see, unless this really offends what we now call human rights, we should just, let people do these things. So if they want to worship Jesus, of whom we don't even know for sure that he existed, of whom we may very reasonably doubt that he rose from the dead, as Christians believe, well, if we're going to accept that, we might just as well accept that Hindus believe that Rama lived there, 5,000 years ago or so, that he lived at that particular place, that he had that particular life, you see, going to liberate his wife who had been abducted by Ravana to Sri Lanka and so on. That may be true. We have a tradition that says it is true, and we have no tradition that says it is not true. So it is reasonable to accept provisionally, unless there are really strong reasons not to, that Rama lived and that, he had the kind of... there are a number of reasons for assuming a certain historicity. For example, in the Mahabharata, which Hindus date as later than the Ramayana, you find the fighters using metal weapons. At that time they already had copper, iron perhaps, whereas in the Ramayana you find Rama using bow and arrow, you find Hanuman using a mace. What more primitive weapon can you get? So quite possibly this reflects a very ancient story, but in fact a very ancient human situation, very ancient events that may really have taken place and that narrators have preserved for posterity. So most likely this has a historical core, and quite possibly he was born there. But you see, the opponents of this assumption say, but Hindu tradition itself gives away that the location of Ayodhya is unreliable. Because they say that the place had been forgotten. This is said in the Puranas, and that Vikramaditya, some king of 2,000 years ago, discovered the place. So this indicates that, this may have been a nice way of putting it, that in fact somebody, who knew of the narrative glory of Ayodhya simply picked a place at his own convenience, and this here must have been Ayodhya. You see, in religious history you find a lot of fraud. Like in the history of the Christian saints, you find saints that have never existed, saints that did miracles that are certainly quite impossible, quite unhistorical, or that the miracles attributed to one saint are stolen by another saint. Like you see, this saint miraculously revived 3 people, and so the other saint, but our saint revived 9 people. And so you get this kind of competition, also, simply for the revenue of pilgrimages and so on. So you could theoretically argue that, this story about Vikramaditya rediscovering lost Ayodhya may have been a way of saying that he or somebody just decided arbitrarily this place here is Ayodhya, and from now on everybody will accept the convention that this is where Rama lived. This is not impossible, but at any rate, in that case, still the convention that that place was Ayodhya, that was the birthplace of Rama, easily predates this controversy. It is not as if Hindus have invented this in order to make some scurrilous claim on a Muslim side. That is not the case at all. It was very much a Hindu place.
This debate about this topic on TV have probably not been there in person to this site before it was brought down, before it was demolished. I have been there personally before it was brought down, when it was called Babri Masjid. I've seen it inside and outside. Had you?
Yes, I've been there twice, and of course I've seen with my own eyes that there were Hindu elements in the building, like these pillars, showing Hindu gods and so on. So that was one way that Muslims used in order to flaunt their victory over infidelity. That you see, they showed off some pieces of pagan architecture that they could incorporate in their mosque. You see, as a symbol of the victory of the true religion over the false religion.